Welcome to everyone joining us today for our first in a series of online live public events on spirit in action, civic engagement, and the religious life. My name is Rebecca Esterson. I'm on the faculty here at the Center for Swedenborgian Studies, and I want to welcome you all warmly. It's really just lovely to see your faces, to see your names, to have a sense that we're coming together here to begin this very exciting series. We're actually, before I say much more about the series and about what we're to expect tonight, we're going to open with a centering moment offered to us by Terrie Crenshaw. So we're going to go ahead and have a centering moment, so you can just bring yourself, center yourself, and receive this message.
Greetings and welcome. For our first event to open up, I'd like to share some quotes from Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who recently transitioned. When war came to Vietnam, monks and nuns were confronted with the question of whether to adhere to the contemplative life and stay meditating in the monasteries, or to help those around them suffering under the bombings and turmoil of war. Thich Nhat Hanh was one of those who chose to do both, and in doing so founded the engaged Buddhism movement. His life has since been dedicated to the work of inner transformation for the benefit of individuals and society. When asked recently how we can have peace in the face of the climate crisis and the collapse of civilization, he replied, "It is possible for us to do something now. Don't despair. There's something we can all do. There's still a chance. Recognize that and do it, and you will find peace." So in Vietnamese Buddhism, politics and spirituality support each other. Spirituality is not cut off from the world. Meditation is not a place where you hide yourself. Meditation is not to escape from society, but to come back to ourselves and see what is going on. Once there is seeing, there must be acting. With mindfulness, we know what to do and what not to do to help. Our enemies are not human beings. They are cravings, anger, hatred, suspicion, despair. All of these things show the power of the people, the power of humanity, the power of love. In Vietnam, we clearly saw how true spiritual power can move gently and peacefully to change a whole nation, yes, even a whole world.
Thank you, Terrie, for that message, for giving us a message to center our thoughts and our intentions are tonight. So again, this is the opening event of a 5-event series on civic action and the religious life. I want to quickly preview the other 4 events. Hopefully you have all seen the flyer. I will just run through these events. They're happening 1 a month, all on Monday evenings from 7:30 to 9 p.m. Eastern time. So this same time, same place, on Monday evenings, once a month. The next event will be Monday, February 28th, and the topic will be Interfaith Advocacy 101. We are very fortunate to have members of the Friends Committee on National Legislation with us for the next 3 sessions to be doing training with us on how to become civically engaged in very, very practical real ways. So that will be session 2 on February 28th. Session 3 on March 28th will be on the topic of lobby training and how to engage Congress, again, with members of the Friends Committee on National Legislation. The 4th session will be on the topic, how do I raise my voice? Where do I go from here? Again, with members of the FCNL. We'll be looking at the questions, what does success look like? How do I build meaningful partnerships for advocacy in my community? How to lift up these issues in the media. And our 5th and final session will be on Monday, May 23rd, in which we will have a panel of Swedenborgians in the field. So we'll be hearing from a number of people on what civic engagement and the religious life looks like for them. So that is our program. Tonight is the first event, again, in this series. And here's what the program will look like. We are going to have a lecture on Swedenborg's civic engagement, retrospectively considered, from the Reverend Dr. James Lawrence, who is the Dean of the Center for Swedenborgian Studies here in Berkeley. After we hear that presentation, we will have two very brief responses from Reverend Robert McCluskey and myself. And at that point, there will be time for Q&A. We invite you to write your questions and comments in the comments section on the Zoom screen. So if you look down at in the center of the bottom part of your Zoom screen, you should see a chat button. And we invite you to put your questions in the chat. Reverend Shada Sullivan, who is hosting for us tonight, will be reading those questions and will moderate the Q&A when the time comes. So that's the program for this evening. And I think that's all I have to say. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Reverend Dr. James Lawrence.
Hey, really kind of fun and interesting gathering. I know most of you, but I don't know everybody. Good to see some new faces, and certainly good to see longtime friends and beloved colleagues. I'm going to have a little visual aid to share while I go through some comments. So some people say a picture's worth quite a few words. So if you will bear with me as I get So here we have this question about Swedenborg's own civic engagement retrospectively considered. And the current question that's frequently discussed in Swedenborgian history is whether the church should take political stands or get active in political issues going on in culture. Our overall history hews toward a primarily spiritual philosophy, voice, and culture that has often been understood in our churches as essentially a place of political neutrality, encouraging people to use spiritual principles to apply it to their larger lives as they see fit. However, that very same history also reveals several risings of Swedenborgian voice on social issues within the churches. In recent times, the dramatic upswing in social justice theology in contemporary culture, contemporary religious culture, has spurred the current work of the Social Justice Committee in our church to focus on how our spiritual heritage might be a resource for those seeking a connection between Swedenborgian thought and the social issues engaging us today. Since Swedenborg plays a singularly influential role in our tradition, it's worth asking how he approached the matter of action in the social arena as part of his faith commitments. So social justice theology as we know it today arose many decades after Swedenborg left the natural world. Certainly, there have been connections between principles of truth and social commitments throughout Judeo-Christian history, extending all the way back to the Old Testament prophets such as Isaiah and Jeremiah, as well as all the examples in the New Testament of Jesus's outreach to the marginalized. But what we think of today as social justice, a social justice emphasis in the religious voice that's now so prominent in many contemporary movements, it's helpful to frame Swedenborg's biography, his real life in his own times, in a historical perspective. So Swedenborg was not a social justice theologian or a reformer social justice theologian in the modern sense. And he did not address specific issues. He did not call out specific issues in his theological works for commentary vis-a-vis spiritual wisdom. And this extends even to the institution of slavery, though it was quite prominent in the London where he spent 13 years working on his spiritual books. 10 million slaves were merchandised through 18th century England, and London was by far the busiest port city through which such commerce passed. Placards selling slaves was still common and publicly visible in Swedenborg's London, and abolitionism against this practice was hotter in Swedenborg's London than anywhere else in Europe. Yet there is no direct line of theological application in his writings to guide readers on how to address that issue or any other specific social issue. That kind of theological application to specific social issues arises nearly a century after Swedenborg wrote. Mid-19th century Italian Jesuit scholar Luigi Tapparelli not only is the one who first coined the term social justice, but he was also the first Christian theologian to elaborate theological foundations for addressing specific social issues arising in contemporary histories. And of course, this is the exact same time when Tapparelli starts writing in 1850 that Karl Marx has just produced his Communist Manifesto in 1848. And Marx keeps writing during the same second half of the 19th century his social critique of laissez-faire capitalism, very critical of Christianity for being complicit in social ills. But on the other side, Tapparelli's work was creating new lines of discourse inside of Christianity for addressing social justice issues. And Pope Leo XIII in 1891 is the first encyclical coming from Rome, commenting on social justice theology and applying it to the working classes. And then the 20th century, we're off and running with the social gospel movement, liberation theology, and everything we got going today with literally hundreds of theologians working on the issue. So was Swedenborg, because of this context, out of the loop? Was he too detached from the social good in his own life? Well, the matter's not so simple. He was not detached. Swedenborg's engagement with the political and civic realm in his own life reveals a very deep commitment to actions, and his theology contains both foundation and vision for a social justice arc, if you have eyes to see it, to give us encouragement and vision for today. Swedenborg had a very special social location. He was born among powerful elites. He was raised among the politically engaged. His father was the chaplain to the royal family when Emmanuel was little, and royalty was very familiar in the household. And his father, Dean Jesper Svedberg, becomes dean of the cathedral at Uppsala, the largest cathedral in the country by far, the seat of the major university. And Emmanuel was only 5 years old when he came into this kind of world of his father's sphere. Later on, as Swedenborg knew royalty, King Charles XII, who is still to date the most written about monarch in Sweden's history of a monarchy, befriended Swedenborg and enlisted him in the Great Northern War when Swedenborg was a very young man after his college days, as Sweden aggressively, Charles XII aggressively fought Russia, tried to protect and gain more lands. And there were several projects involving math and mechanical engineering that Charles XII loved incorporating Swedenborg's genius. And then in 1719, as part of Swedenborg's social location, the family becomes ennobled. And because Swedenborg's the eldest surviving male child in that family, Jesper already being in the clergy, Swedenborg begins serving in the Swedish parliament at age 31. Now the Riksdag, which is what the Swedish parliament is called in that century in Swedish, had 4 chambers: the nobility, the clergy, the burghers, which is essentially kind of the privileged, prosperous class, and the peasantry, or all the workers. All the workers, they had a voice, they had a chamber. And Swedenborg served in this structure for a half a century. He fought very strenuously for evolving this design of Sweden's government, because he grew up with an absolute monarchy, and only in 1720 had there been a new constitution limiting the monarchy and increasing the voice of governance in the country, and Swedenborg was a prominent exponent of that. We can infer from his ardent advocacy of these 4 chambers that he viewed the religious voice as a crucial component in establishing public laws and policies. So there's a fun little scholarship rumble going on in the last several years. Not so much inside of Swedenborgianism, but the secular scholars who study Swedenborgian culture. Swedenborg's been rising in secular studies for about 50 years, becoming more and more of a figure, the more that non-confessional religious people are writing religious history, and more secular scholars are looking at what's happening in religious currents and culture in the early modern through the contemporary period. Swedenborg's seen as a much more significant figure by secular scholars than by the confessional scholars who are from the big traditions we all know about, who simply do not look at the margins as important. So there was a kind of in Swedenborg's century, it was dominated by 2 parties, the caps and the hats. This did not last forever, but it's very famous as part of Sweden's history, what was going on in the 18th century, Swedenborg's very time. The caps were seen as wearing nightcaps. They were pretty much asleep. They were isolationists. They believed in very little government activity, and people thought they were basically snoozing. The hats were a faction in Sweden that was still following the Great Northern War, very ambitious for Swedenborg's fortune on the international stage, very interested in forging alliances, especially with France. And they were called the Hats because they were seen as having this very kind of trendy style. They were bon vivant and believed in a high profile in culture. So the kerfuffle is that we have this biography published in 2012, the most recent biography of Swedenborg by Marcia Key-Schuchard. It's scarcely read by anybody inside the churches, but it's read by far more than all the other biographies by people outside the churches. And her name is the one most outside scholars think of. They want to know, well, what Schuchard, does she write about all the stuff about Swedenborg? So look at the title of her book, issued by a very respectable academic European press, Brill. Emanuel Swedenborg, Secret Agent on Earth and in Heaven, with an equally suggestive subtitle, Jacobites, Jews, and Freemasons in Early Modern Sweden. Jacobites referring to people that's the Latinate word for James, King James Bible, trying to bring the House of Stuart back to the throne in England and against the Hanovers because of the way the alliances work internationally. Jacobites had all these plots to restore the Stuart house. They never succeeded. She argues that Swedenborg's involvement in international politics is the really deep story in Swedenborg's life that explains a lot of puzzle pieces in his religious writings. The 600-page book details Swedenborg's political activities abroad and at home and raises some new questions about the extent of Swedenborg's involvement with the high-level national geopolitical adventures. I want to say she's very controversial, and that would be a whole other night to talk about the many claims made in this book. But the point is, the voice on the stage right now trying to detail Swedenborg as a highly politically engaged person, and to what extent that is true. She's very critical of the Swedenborgian churches and their biographers for being on the whole obtuse about what the old boy was up to. And she claims confessional Swedenborgians have been so uninformed on Swedenborg's political activities that they've even gotten his party affiliation wrong, that he was that Swedenborgians has always thought he was a cap, and yet he was one of the most important hats in Choussard's opinion. On this particular point, though, it's very hard to understand the foundation for her claim that Swedenborgians have always said he was a cap, because while you can find one comment in one letter in the 3-volume of 400 documents in Toffel's documents that indicates he might have had cap loyalties, all of the Swedenborgian press's biographies say that he was really not a party man either way, but intellectually and socially, he was much more aligned with the hats. Whatever head covering he favored, and it is without doubt that his wigs were worn in the style favored by cultural elites, Swedenborg made his mark in the civil arena in all kinds of ways that are easy to see. What exists in the preserved record is there's at least 100 pages of formal addresses that he gave to Parliament over time, and that's only what's been preserved. They touch on many issues as they arise here and there, but he was especially renowned for his mathematical, financial genius, for his insights into economic issues, and was a leading voice during solving a national economic crisis in the early 1760s. But his most visible political party action came as an appeal defending the Prime Minister, Anders von Hopkins, who happened to be a good friend of Swedenborg's, and who pretty much confessed he thought Swedenborg's whole religious approach was right, if he would just eliminate all the stories about the spiritual world, that it would be the best presentation of religion in Sweden. But Hopkins was in huge trouble for having led to some international losses and created a lot of debts. And Swedenborg had a very passionate appeal defending von Hopkins. So you could see that he participated in even the personality issues going on in politics. He was an ardent advocate of the limited monarchy, as I've already said, and took a very strong stand against an attempted coup by the Queen at that time in 1756. You know how these marriages are in historical Europe with people of families from different countries as part of the alliances that different countries would build with each other for geopolitical concerns. And Lovisa Ulrich was out of Prussia. She hated the limited monarchy and actually fomented a coup attempt for which 3 leaders were hung in public, that were caught, and she was spared. She was spared that. Swedenborg, though, in that period of time, was a vociferous advocate against returning to an absolute monarchy. So he was very active in a very political sphere. This, by the way, is the very same queen that we know about with the Queen's Secret, who participates in one of the most famous, probably in the top two, it's certainly in the top three of the stories that are fairly well demonstrated by witnesses of Swedenborg's clairvoyant powers, the Queen's Secret, that occurs about 5 years later after this coup attempt. So if we have eyes to see, social justice foundations do exist in Swedenborg's theology. We can see it in his chapter on charity, in his final Summa, True Christianity, the last book that he published. Charity is love in action. It's doing love out there in the world, not only with the next door neighbor, but in bigger spheres. And so Swedenborg shapes in True Christianity who the neighbor is. It's about love and action to the neighbor, not just a passive love, having nice thoughts about people, but actively becoming an effective, loving agent. And he has his famous degrees of the neighbor that extends beyond the individual next door and on the street to larger and larger spheres of society, ultimately encompassed by what he would see as the universal church, which ultimately connects with the highest neighbor, who is God. So society is the national scene and the large social forces in which one is involved compared to other social structures on the planet. One's local larger social structures was very much a part of his definition of love in action. And his legendary engaged spirituality of uses, and I love Terrie's opening meditation reflection with Thich Nhat Hanh. Thich Nhat Hanh coined the phrase engaged spirituality. It's one I like to use a lot in Swedenborgian studies, and Thich Nhat Hanh is one of my favorites. So it was very special opening. And Swedenborg has an engaged spirituality, and it's especially around his renowned way that he shaped the idea of uses and usefulness as a way of living, as an everyday way of functioning, as a way of kind of growing into being a part of the good life. And it can certainly be understood as facilitating usefulness in these larger degrees of the neighbor, and that there are potent forms of usefulness to be done as love and action in social justice work. And additionally, we can locate love to the larger degrees of neighbor in his concept of the maximus homo. I got to thinking about this more deeply after reading Shada Sullivan's sermon on this, which is translated Universal Human. Swedenborg has this concept of the maximus homo. It's like that everybody all together, including God, including the divine human, is in a human form, and that we all play this interconnected spheres of uses and parts that help this whole body to live, have its life, and have its potencies of being a space of love and action. And so we live profoundly in social relationships in the maximus homo, and our commitment to love and wisdom must take the whole always into consideration. Healthiness of the whole is synonymous with social justice. So, does our question asking how Swedenborg approached the matter of active involvement in the social arena as part of his spiritual vision get us anywhere? I think we can infer from Swedenborg's civic engagement retrospectively considered that he participated at a high level in the public square, given the context of religion and society in his times. Therefore, if we wish to look to Swedenborg as an example, we can say he provides encouragement for speaking and acting in the public square at a high level, given the context of religion and society in our own times. So what does that look like for any one individual? We each have the freedom to find our own answers.
Thank you. So we'll turn first to Reverend Robert McCluskey for a response.
Okay, thank you. I have been given 5 minutes. It may go a little bit over. This is so exciting. First question. Is this a cap or a hat? Okay. I like the both and approach. I find it is, and Jim and I will be talking about this later, I'm sure, for ages. It is useful to know of Swedenborg's own civic engagement. However, in keeping with the theme of this series, I am more interested in how our church being engaged in civil life, the public square, right now. I think there is much to learn, not from his own experience, but from his theology. I want to keep myself in time here. Before the term social justice was introduced, as Jim pointed out, the issues were already present. The widow and the orphan, the Good Samaritan, doing justice, poverty, hunger, slavery, etc. The idea of helping those who need help is at the heart of the Bible. The call for social justice runs through all the prophets. So what changed to give rise to this concept of social justice that we know and Swedenborg didn't? One reason is that society simply became more complex, diverse, and interconnected. New perspectives emerged and new ideas were born. Swedenborg's world was one of theocracy and provincialism. Church and state were wed with the goal of maintaining status quo and uniformity. And most people did not travel very far from home. We live in a world that is democratic and cosmopolitan, with a separation of church and state and open to diversity and change. There is another reason, I think, why social justice is at the heart of most churches now. Swedenborgians hold that during Swedenborg's time, the heart of Christianity was undergoing a radical change, a new church. Some, like me, see this new spirit of freedom reflected in the bold experiment known as the United States, the end of theocracy, the church free to finally be the church. Which brings us not to Swedenborg's own personal activity, but to the ecclesial responsibility of our own time. How should the new church act in this new age? And I want to point out, I made some notes here, so I'm going to interrupt my own remarks. It is true that Swedenborg was strongly involved in politics, but not as a clergy person. He was involved as a member of the nobility. He was doing politics as an individual. His church was also doing politics with the Queen. There was no separation. Jim notes that we have a history of political neutrality. Or actually, he started by asking, should the church get involved in politics? I've answered this question many, many times. Partisan politics, no. Social issues, which have a political dimension, yes. We have a history of political neutrality, but now we know that silence equals complicity. We extol individual efforts, which rarely lead to deep change, but resist communal action. For many, the church, like Marx noted, is a refuge and haven from involvement in the outer world, an escape from social responsibility. True, Swedenborg was civically engaged and politically active, as I said, not as a clergy person, but as an individual member of parliament. And a big difference, his church was politically active, but always hand in hand with the status quo and the reigning government. They were not free to critique the government. And so we tend to see sweet charity coming from the individual, and we forget that the church as a whole has always been at the center of political power, forming policies for both good and ill. And we think of Amanda's article in the Messenger about the Presbyterian churches work in this area, and we're going to hear from the Friends Committee. Being engaged in social issues is not equivalent to taking political stands. The church should never take a partisan political stand and should always be engaged with the issues that affect the well-being of our neighbor. The inability to be clear about this important distinction is an albatross around the neck of the church and a source of constant frustration for me. There's a seesaw dynamic we're good at. We say, let's talk, more action, let's do something. And as soon as someone puts forward the type of action, we say, oh, we can't do that. That's too political. That will get us into trouble. Of course, we are all free to speak individually in the public square. The First Amendment makes this available to everyone, not just those who are highborn. But we are also free and perhaps responsible to speak collectively as a church in the public square. Freedom is also found in the First Amendment. And this is true even and especially when we are at odds with the status quo, the reigning political power. As a member of parliament, Swedenborg had a great deal of influence and power, and he used it. Although it was true in the past to a small degree, few Swedenborgians today hold any political position or power comparable to Swedenborg's. And as individuals, there is little we can do. Together, there is much. What level of influence or power might we have if we acted together as members of one church, instead of hoping for spontaneous efforts on the part of individuals? I want to close with referring people back to the theological points that Jim introduced at the end. We do have a mandate for social justice embedded in the writings. The fact that they're not clearly stated in our terms is, I think, due to the very brief overview I started with about the entirely different worlds we live in. But besides the degrees of the neighbor, charity as willing the good of another, and the universal human and usefulness, I would simply add the Swedenborg's idea that charity and faith are empty terms unless they are put into concrete action, and that we live in three realms: spiritual, moral, and civil, and that it's our responsibility to be active and responsible in all those realms. So, Jim concludes that Swedenborg participated at a high level in the public square. His example encourages us to speak and act in the public square. I think his theology does more than encourage us. I think it calls us and requires us to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. I think the group gathered here probably has a lot to say. I'm sure you all have thoughts and questions arising, so I'm eager to hear from the group, but I'll just offer a few more thoughts before we do so. First, it's hard, the way Jim opened that lecture with the image of the slave trade in London. It's hard when we're looking at this history retrospectively considered to see Swedenborg's relative silence on that issue in particular as exemplary from our context, from any context, really. That's a hard thing to think about. But I'm not sure Swedenborg was silent on that issue or on the issues of the sins committed on the behalf of Christianity going on around him. There's a very interesting number in his spiritual diary where Swedenborg's had this experience of dogs violently attacking him. And he compares it to Spaniards attacking the natives on the American continent with dogs. And so this violence, this colonial violence, is very much part of his internal psyche, and he's interpreting his own spiritual violence through that lens. Swedenborg also believed that the Christian church of his day had reached such a level of corruption. It had reached an absolute peak in corruption. And this was due to the love of dominating over others. So much so that the Christian heaven and he specifically says the Christian heaven. All the other heavens were okay, but the Christian heaven was in danger of being infected by this love of dominion. And this kind of cosmic spiritual imbalance was the reason for Christ's needing to come again, to be born anew spiritually on the earth. So I think his whole kind of spiritual cosmology was tied up in this critique of Christian dominion that relates to slavery and colonialism of his day. And certainly retrospectively considered, we can see how the sins of the day are reverberating still in our times around the world. I have a couple of written comments. So something of a paradox that both Jim and Robert have touched on in our Swedenborgian communities today, and that's this focus that we have on intellectual study. Sometimes we are seen, or we see ourselves as kind of academic or having a bookish approach to religious life. But the paradox is that at the core, the message of our teachings is that love and action in the world are what constitute a religious life, not study, not even right understanding or right belief. Swedenborg writes that a person has reached a state of wisdom when they no longer have any concern about understanding what is true and good, but are motivated by willing and living what is true and good, for this is wisdom. In our current context, many of us find ourselves stretching out, feeling called to an active engagement in social justice, to being change makers, advocates, engaged in the world of writing, engaged in the work of righting the wrongs of our society and repairing the wounds to our planet and to our fellow beings on this planet. We find ourselves perhaps motivated by the great Swedenborgian activist Helen Keller, whose religious convictions drove her to a life of advocacy for those on the margins, including the working poor, women, the disabled, and racial minorities. As Reverend Sage Cole and others have recounted for us in telling her history, Helen Keller believed that if we want a better, more equitable society, we need to step up and engage as vocal and active citizens in our communities. This is what motivated her to be a founding member of the American Civil Liberties Union in 1920. And on the topic of civil rights, she wrote, "When one comes to think of it, there are no such things as divine, immutable, or inalienable rights. Rights are things we get when we are strong enough to make good our claim on them." So I want to close my comments and my response by mentioning one aspect of a Swedenborgian theology that is central to a life of usefulness and civic activity. And it's in Swedenborg's little work, Charity, in which Swedenborg suggests that doing good in the world does not wipe out evil. We can't just be nice. We can't just be kind to one another, give to charity, help the needy, do our jobs well, and have evil disappear from the world. These are all part of the religious life, but there is a prerequisite activity before we do these things. And that is doing the internal work of repentance. Our good change-making actions in the world must come hand in hand with the work of introspection, private and collective, confrontation of the ways we are complicit in the very harms that we are interested in eradicating, the harms that create suffering and systems of oppression in our society. See, these are the things that Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of in that opening reflection when he spoke of cravings, anger, hatred, suspicion, and despair. This work of repentance happens on an individual level and on a collective level, on the level of church and community. So I'll just mention the group Swedenborgians in Action Against Racism, which is one of the co-sponsoring organizations of this series, is one way in which the Swedenborgian community is attempting to do this work or beginning to do this work collectively. And we invite everybody here to be a part of these efforts, to study our history, to investigate any tendencies or habits that we have inherited, that we have inherently, tendencies that are harmful or stand in the way of flourishing and healing. And I'll just close with Helen Keller's wonderful quote, "I am only one, but still I am one. I cannot do everything, but still I can do something. And because I cannot do everything, I will not refuse to do the something that I can do."
So thank you so much for joining us. I was wondering, would people be okay if I just close this out with a prayer? Okay.
Thank you.
Our loving God, what a tender space that we enter into when we ask these questions of you, these huge heart questions of how can we do good in this beautiful world you have made. It's not always clear. We are so small. We are but one, and yet we are connected. We are connected through the way we are made to see and value and love each other. And so help us, Lord, to discern for ourselves the ways that we are called to care and work for the transformation of your world. This is always going to be hard work going forward, but help us, Lord, to see the enchantment and the joy in it, especially when we are able to take this journey with others as we have done so today. We thank you, Lord. Amen.